being driven out with fire and being driven out with fire power, being stalked, being targeted and harassed by a government out of control. My name is Judson Witham, and my record is long and it's very clear. I began realizing how underhanded the government is when it wants something, when they targeted my parents at Harris Bay on Lake George, New York. A group of environmental conservation types, just like the Department of the Interior, just like the EPA, and just like the Bureau of Land Management. My parents were the target of so-called conservationists in New York, as in they had wanted to buy my parents' lands on the east side of Lake George for many years, and my parents didn't want to sell it. Excuse me, folks. It's winter time. I have a little chest cold. My parents built a very nice family marina, originally named the Swamp on Harris Bay at Lake George. Today, you can see it on the internet. It's been renamed by the people who currently possess it, the Harris Bay Yacht Club. And you'll notice all around the marina, the mountains and the lake, beautiful lake, and the wetlands behind the lake, the marsh, very large marsh, the swamp that my parents put together and worked very hard to establish the marina back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Dad and Mom had served during the Second World War, and they came from a long line of American settlers. They came from a long line of English serfs and peasants, I guess, the people that worked the land. And the people that control the Environmental Conservation Department in New York, the New York State Forest Rangers. And I use that word forest for a very specific reason. I'll get to that in a moment. When my parents began to realize that the lake level during the winter ice cover, the lake level was being manipulated up and down. 18 inches of ice would form and the lake level would drop, dragging their marina docks down into the lake and crushing their foundations. And then in the springtime, before the ice would melt off, the lake would come booming back up, sometimes 2 feet, sometimes quite a bit more. And it would rip and shred the entire marina from the foundation under the docks. The support systems for the walkways and the gangways on the marina docks would be destroyed. Well, in the years since, I've discovered that Lake George was being used by people who had engineered it to use it. They had built mechanisms at the north end of the lake at Ticonderoga to funnel huge amounts of water to the International Paper Corporation for the production of electricity and to run a very large paper mill that was dumping huge amounts of extremely toxic sludge and wastes from the industries along the Lachute River. They were flushing their giant mill pond. You can look up the Lake George trespassing cases, and you can look up a man by the name of Apperson and a man by the name of Langmuir. that spearheaded a fight against the International Paper Corporation for the artificial manipulating of the lake levels on Lake George. They referred to it as the mill pond. The dumping of the water is controlled by a flusher, literally, just like your toilet. It's controlled by a flusher. It's called a penstock at the dam, where they have floodgates they can open and close, directing all this water from the lake into turbines to generate electricity for the International Paper Corporation, which coincidentally was begun and built in America and around the world by the Colchester family in Colchester, Maine. And I believe there was a Colchester, New Hampshire as well, but don't hold me to that. The Colchesters are the royal family. The Colchesters are the bloodline that Colchester, England is named after. Colchester, England is the oldest city, town, the village of Colchester along the English Channel. Was established by the Romans 600 years and more before Christ. Where I'm going with this entire story is simply this. My parents were targeted for their marina. The flushing of the lake was being done on purpose to destroy my parents' ability to earn a living, to profit in their business. And sure enough, the Department of Environmental Conservation today owns everything Mom and Dad ever worked for. The Department of Environmental Conservation. After Dad died, I started asking questions as a young man, and I filed an open records demand on the Environmental Conservation Department, and a lawyer from DEC granted it. I traveled to Colony. Imagine that, the colonies, the English colonies. I traveled to Colony, New York, adjacent what was originally known as New Amsterdam, Fort Orange, the Dutch fort at Albany, New York. Colonies immediately adjacent to there and to a place known as Van Rensselaer Wick. I'll attach the link down below to the Adirondacks conspiracy, and all the details that I can share with you on this are clearly published there. Needs a little editing. I'm not the New York Times, and I'm certainly not the National Geographic or CNN News. I'm not owned by some big corporation controlled by Ted Turner. The Adirondacks conspiracy reveals that the British came across the Atlantic after building ships, after cutting down the king's trees in those forests, those royal forests that I've spoken about many times before. The royal forests are covered in the Adirondack conspiracy. Cutting down the royal forest and building the ships to come across the Atlantic to exploit and to extract the land, to remove the natural resources down in the ground. This has been going on a very long time, for centuries. Just exactly like the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of the Interior and the United States Geological Survey and the EPA and the Department of Defense and the United States Government Incorporated has been doing in America for an extremely long time. They mine all the national parks. They drill for oil and gas. They engage in open pit strip minings with companies like Kennecott Copper. The Gold Butte operations, where the Bundy Ranch are located at Gold Butte, Nevada. The massive mineral and precious metals and gas and uranium concentrations underneath the Hammonds Ranch, I have posted across the world on the net the Department of Interior's own prospecting maps. You see, the Department of the Interior has all of the precious metals, the oil and the gas, the gems, the geothermal, the uranium, the thorium, the monazite, the wollastonite, which I reveal in the Adirondacks Conspiracy. The United States government's in the mining business on a massive scale, and they target landowners for what's theirs, just exactly like my parents were targeted. So please take some time, and the link is provided below, and it will reveal to you that these giant land acquisition conspiracies, these giant land acquisition missions of the United States government and all the lawyers that control the Senate and Congress and the executive offices of the president and all the corporations and the investors in the United States of America Incorporated in their government in the District of Columbia. Now, to kind of change gears and talk a little bit about fire, I know exactly what it's like to have people trying to burn you out. I know exactly what it's like to have people trying to bomb you out and mutilate and poison your horses and mutilate and poison your dogs and threaten and target your family and stalk your family, because it's all been done to me more than once. You see, folks, I'm the man from Texas, up north of Houston, that blew the whistle on the massive land fraud schemes that were connected to the savings and loan implosion of the 1980s. I'm the guy who lived up just north of Houston and exposed thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of completely illegal land developments all over the state of Texas, and many tens of thousands more of these unrecorded red flag, toxic, ghost, zombie, wildcat, phantom, unrecorded red flag, colonious, dangerous, substandard land developments. They're all over the nation. And this man right here, I've spent more than 35 years exposing it all. What does the government do to people that blow the whistle? What does the government do to people who stand up? Like the Hammonds, like the Bundys, and like a lot of the other ranchers and landowners, not just in the West, but all over the United States. The thing that I can tell you that may make sense to you is when people are targeted in the fashion that the BLM targets people, and when they're targeted in the fashion like when the Federal Bureau of Investigation targets people, the game gets very rough. When my parents were targeted by DEC, and when I traveled to Colony, New York as a 20-year-old man to look at the files that had been amassed, there was 2 large, thick files on my parents. And when this lawyer in Colony, New York handed them to me, I had just begun to examine the investigation, the dossiers that they'd amassed on my parents. Clifford and Anita Witham. They had dossiers. Why the state of New York had dossiers and investigation files on my parents' land holdings? They were looking for ways to corner them and to cut them off and to force them out. Economically, strategically, they were denying them permits, they were harassing them. They were constantly causing my mother and father problems to cost them money, including the artificial fluctuation of the lake levels on Lake George. I have a wonderful site, the poisoning of Lake Champlain, the dumping of 800 tons of waste and industrial materials into Lake Champlain using Lake George as a giant flusher, flushing that ice in the middle of the winter, raising the ice in the spring to flush it again. And every time that ice would go up and down, like John Apperson and Irving Langmuir noted in the Lake George trespassing cases, where Lake George was exposed as a mill pond, reveals that what happened to my mother and father is very real. You can see the Harris Bay Yacht Club there today, and I assure you the Witham family, my brothers and sisters and mother and dad, worked very hard to build what's today known as the Harris Bay Yacht Club. Now on to my story about fire and getting burnt and bombed out. When I watched the fiasco and the targeting of people in Texas that blew the whistle, that stood up, I had a Norman Britain Defender. Excuse me. A Norman Britain Defender repeatedly flying my property along Village Way, east of the city of Conroe, Texas. Repeatedly, they do it in broad daylight. Right down on the treetops, they'd come flying over time and time and time again. And I'd never seen a Norman Britain Defender. Very odd looking aircraft. Square, wing above the cabin, very boxy looking, about the size of a King Air aircraft. It's a big plane. The first thing I began to notice when I realized something was wrong is that this aircraft had no registration numbers on it. There was no alphanumerical registration under the wing or along the fuselage, which is required on private aircraft and corporate aircraft. It was an unmarked airplane. And for many years, I didn't know who owned that plane, but I do now. That's the FBI's FLIR aircraft that was used at Waco, Texas. The very same plane. Now, the first time that my family was threatened with fire in the middle of the night, about 2:30 in the morning, on an early Monday morning, before the Commissioner's Court convened at Montgomery County at Conroe, Texas. What woke me up in the middle of the night, scared me to death, was the sound of an airplane coming in very fast. And it sounded like it was going to crash into the house. It was coming in, flying very fast, and right on the treetops. They couldn't fly any lower because of the very tall pine trees around my home. I sat there waiting for the sound of the impact of what sounded like a crashing airplane. And it flew right over, dead over the center of the house. And I sat there listening and waiting for it to crash into the trees, not knowing if I was going to have to go out and engage in life saving. It sounded like a crashing aircraft. About 5, maybe 10 seconds later, you could hear a helicopter coming in, same flight line, right down on the deck. And when that helicopter got on top of my home, they deployed a countermeasures package. Flares. They dumped flares all over my home. White phosphorus, Starbright, battlefield illumination flares. Anybody in the military knows what those are used for. They're used for countermeasures to draw off heat-seeking missiles, and they're also used to light up an LZ, a landing zone. It wasn't long thereafter that I was in the Commissioner's Court of Montgomery County, about 6 hours later. And I addressed the sheriff of the county, Guy Williams, eyeball to eyeball in front of Judge Alan Barb Sadler, the whole Commissioner's Court of Montgomery County, and a packed county Commissioner's Court meeting, packed. And I told them the next time they try to burn my home down, I was going to shoot down the aircraft. Guy Williams asked me if I had something to take out, a helicopter. And I replied, I just might, and I walked out of that courtroom. There were literally dozens and dozens of witnesses in the top law enforcement of Montgomery County, Texas. Judge Alan Sadler remembers that day. So does Sheriff Guy Williams. And I believe that David Walker, the current Montgomery County attorney, was in the Commissioner's Court. Now, why was that being done to me and my family? Well, number one, the massive land frauds that I blew the whistle on in the Houston Chronicle, in the Houston Post, on ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox and PBS, all the local news affiliates in Houston covered the story. The newspapers covered the story. And I was actually interviewed on an FM radio station out of Conroe, Texas, believe it or not, KIKR Radio. Kicker Radio in Conroe, Texas interviewed me live from a studio sound booth, explaining to the world, this would have been in 1991, about 1991, I believe, 92, how these massive land frauds were being financed and how these massive land fraud financings were occurring through the U.S. postal system, and how the use of the United States postal system in perpetrating a massive real estate and banking fraud is very serious felonies. It's felonious conduct. My information on these massive land frauds is linked and connected below. I've been standing up and fighting back and speaking out and blowing the whistle on the massive real estate swindles and frauds that have caused the most recent massive collapse of the real estate-based subprime mortgage-backed securities fiasco on Wall Street and all the big banks in the nation. My record for blowing the whistle on this massive financial fraud and the real estate at the epicenter of it all is attached below. Rico Realty, the missing trillions. The Great Texas Bank Job, which I began writing and publishing back in the 1990s. The Land Fraud American Style. The Western Bank American Title. The Paper Land Cons. And a couple of my more famous ones are Felonious, Colonious, and I use a little bit of humor to get attention. I entitled one Felonious, Belonious, Colonious. Huge, vast, massive data dump and information compilation of how they use these real estate schemes and scams to rob hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars from the national banking system. The links are connected below. Standing up, fighting back, like what the Bundys and their fellow Americans, those patriots at the wildlife refuge south of Burns, are doing this morning. Standing up, Ammon Bundy. See, Mr. Bundy probably wonders why he and I are slowly becoming friends. Ammon Bundy probably wonders why I have gotten to know his father Cliven a little bit, and I've contacted great numbers of people all across the United States that were involved in Occupy, that were involved in the Anonymous, that have been standing up and fighting back to try to stay in their homes. This massive, giant foreclosure fraud fiasco that's raped, just absolutely raped thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and even millions of Americans for their homes and their businesses and their farms. Boy, I wish I could get rid of this cold. Live video here. The fact of the matter is, today in America, we're about 300 years into the extraction. You see, folks, even from the days of Pharaoh and the pyramids, the pharaohs had royal treasure, and the pharaohs had the financial resources to build pyramids. The empires of Rome, the empires of Britain, the empires of the European and the Middle Eastern kingdoms and fiefdoms, and the empire called America, guess where they get all their treasure? You want to call your lifeline? Where do they get all the gold and the silver and the platinum and the uranium and the monazite and the tungsten and the bauxite and the wolozanite and the monazite. And I can keep right on going with molybdenum and platinum and a lot of other minerals that come out of the ground. Minerals, gems, gold, silver, oil, gas, geothermal, timber, the big timber companies like Weyerhaeuser and the big railroads, the land barons, the robber barons. Have you studied the history of the robber barons in America? And the vast, massive thefts of the Indian lands. Boy, there's a concept for all those environmentalists. Where do you think all those parklands came from? Who do you think stole all those parklands that you ride around on your mountain bike and paddle about in your plastic kayaks and go hiking with your Chinese-made hiking boots? Who do you think were conquered and targeted and stalked and killed and beaten and run through with sabers and blown apart with cannons and musket balls and cavalry rifles by people like the Roosevelts? Ain't that interesting? Old Teddy Roosevelt was involved in the last Indian Wars in the West. These people were killed by 1 million paper cuts. Death by 1 million paper cuts. The little tactics that are used to target and stalk and force people out. And I guarantee you the Hammonds family darn sure knows what I'm talking about when they were targeted and stalked, and at every opportunity the Department of the Interior and Bureau of Land Management had to harass them, cost them money, drive them out. I'll bet you Cliven Bundy knows exactly what I'm talking about. The tactics they used, like what was used against my mother and father, and the tactics that are being used every day against literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who have become victims in these real estate, mortgage, subprime, backed securities, toxic zombie asset schemes and scams with their credit default swaps and their derivatives. The big bankster gangsters, the tactics, the paper cuts that are used by these stalkers, by these criminals, by these monsters to steal what's yours. Like all the very valuable material that lays beneath the Hammond Ranch. All that very valuable material that lays beneath the Bundy Ranch. All that very valuable material that lays inside French Mountain. All of those very valuable materials that lay in the Dunham's Bay wetland, the Harris Bay wetland, and the Catskill Bay wetland, Warner Bay wetland. All along the Ridge Road, all along the Bay Road to the north of Queensbury. Just west of Kingsbury in Warren County, New York. Now, to the Mannix Marketing up at Glens Falls, New York, and to the Adirondacker, and to the Adirondack Almanac, and to all the other Lake George Park Commissions and the Lake George Land Commission, excuse me, to the Adirondack Park and to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and to those people that created the royal forests known as the Catskill Park and the royal forests of the Adirondack Park along the North Way that runs from New York to Montreal, the North Way. You see, folks, in Old England, there's a road that runs from London to York, and the name of the road that runs right smack dab through the middle of Sherwood Forest, the royal forests of the British monarchy, the name of that road is the North Way. The name of the road that runs through the forest parks, set aside preservation units in New York, not Old York, not Old England, I'm talking about New England, New York. The road that runs through the parks, the forests. The name of that road is Route 87. Goes from New York City to Montreal. It's called the North Way. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the old feudal land system that went on for many, many years during the days of Robin Hood and Cromwell and William Wallace and all the battles of the English commoner against the crown for their rights, like in the Magna Carta. Well, there's a story for you, the Magna Carta. It was all about land and property rights. The forests and the feudal land system and the lawyers and the gangster banksters that operated all that land-based, real estate-based extraction of very valuable treasure out of the ground for the king and the queen. They took that whole feudal land system and they imported it to New England and New France and New Amsterdam and New Spain. The kings of Europe imposed their feudal land systems on today what's known as America. The links and the information and the history and the facts are linked below. I'm not making this story up. It's a fact, Ammon Bundy. It's a fact for all the men and the women that are standing with Ammon Bundy, his brothers, the ranchers, the landowners, and people all over America that realize that what I'm talking about here, Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, is nothing more than a giant heist. It's a way to impose the ancient feudal land system all across America. Agenda 2030, Agenda 21 has been going on in America since those boats built in England with the king's trees out of the king's forests at the king's harbors by the king's men, like the Colchester family of the International Paper Corporation. You start taking a look into the mining corporations that are extracting like wollastonite out of the Adirondack Park, you'll find out that I-Metals, Nico Mining, that's stripping wollastonite out of the middle of the Adirondack Forest Preserve, it's owned by the Rothschild Natural Resources Corporation, the Rothschild bankers, and they're mining in the middle of America's parks, all over the West, all over Alaska. They're doing it in Indonesia hugely, mass mining operations all across the Pacific Rim. And the mining corporations are owned by the same corporations that own and control and operate the Federal Reserve. I challenge you, do some research. Start running the names of who owns these mining companies. Start tracing mining companies like the Alexandria or Alexander Mining, right there in Burns. They're from London, and they're from the Netherlands. And look it up. Run Alexander Mining, Alexandria Mining. And you'll begin to discover that I-Metals and Nico and the International Paper Corporation and the mining giant in New York there out of Glens Falls, the Barton Mining Corporation, they're mining garnet for sandpaper and industrial abrasives. Barton Mining, the Dumbarton Royals of England, the Dumbarton royal family, the Blue Bloods, the noblemen of England are who actually own Barton Mining. The Bartlett, Pontiff, Stewart, and Rhodes, the big law firm in Glens Falls, they know exactly what I'm talking about because they represent all the mining corporations and the timber companies in New York. Richard Bartlett was the grand poobah of the New York State court system. He was the top judge. He was the top judge for the entire state of New York's unified court system. Richard Bartlett created the unified court system, and Richard Bartlett and his partner, David Stewart, I take that back, Robert Stewart, Bob Stewart, the other brother. His daddy was a conservation agent up around North Creek. You see, Robert Stewart came out of the DEC. And Richard Bartlett was in cahoots with Mr. DEC. Those are the people that wound up with my parents' property. After my parents were targeted and stalked and harassed and investigated, those great big thick investigation files on my parents, when I began to look into those files, an administrative type came in the room and he told me I couldn't look in the files. And I explained to them the attorney just handed them to me. I didn't walk into this building and guess where they were. I didn't walk into this building and just by crystal ball figure out where my parents' files were. I was brought to this huge filing room. There was a lot of file cabinets in this room, folks, by an attorney for DEC. On the same floor as the director of the Department of Environmental Conservation, right next door to the forest rangers, the state police troopers, the forest rangers that are more powerful than New York State Police, the DEC forest rangers, the DEC police, right next door to their offices. I was handed these files by a DEC lawyer. And this administrator type comes in and tells me I can't look at those files. And he's insistent that I give him the files. I tell him, no, I'm going to look at these investigation files on my parents. So he goes away. And I go back to start, reading through these investigation files on my family, my whole family, my mother, my father, my brothers, my sisters, the source of my parents' income. I mean, they had an investigation like a KGB, GRU, National Security Administration, CIA, FBI investigation dossiers on my mother and father. A couple minutes later, this administrator type comes back in the room, and this time he's got an armed, uniformed, the green uniform, state park ranger with him with a gun, demanding that I hand over the files. I look at the ranger and I tell him I'd been given an open records request that had been granted, and I hadn't walked in the building and guessed where these files were. The ranger, he walked off after about 15, 20 seconds. He wasn't getting involved. And the administrator stormed out of the room and went down the hallway with the ranger towards the main offices of the rangers, the environmental police. He went down to the offices of the environmental police, and I went back to looking at the file. A couple minutes later, this administrator comes in the room and he physically attacks me. I'm attacked in my chair. I'm tackled over backwards in a chair and slammed on the floor. And it hurt. I mean, it was a tackle. And the files were being protected in my arms like this. This administrator put his foot in my testicles, in my gut. He puts his foot in my gut and he grabs my arms, jamming his foot into my testicles, and ripped the files from my arms. He ripped the investigation files out of my arms. The stories are contained in my many videos that I've published to the net. Now, I'm getting up close to 40 minutes here, and a lot of the information is in the links below, and I've been blowing the whistle like crazy all over the net for years, so a lot of people know this story. But to Ammon Bundy, to the FBI in Burns, and to the FBI in Washington, D.C., to the FBI Director James Comey, and the Attorney General of the United States, Loretta Lynch, to the Senate and the Congress, and to all the people in America. This nation is being run on a feudal land system. It's being run by the big corporations that own the Federal Reserve and all the Federal Reserve banks, and the corporations like Merrill Lynch that own and run and operate the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation and all the FDIC insured financial institutions across the United States, and the insurance companies that the FDIC insures as well, like AIG and like Lehman Brothers and all the other massive corporations that are too big to fail and got these giant, massive, unbelievable bailouts with all that quantitative easing money they're printing up out of the thin air. Right out of the thin air. Trillions have been created out of the thin air to bail out all the political contributors to the presidents, to the congressmen, to the congresswomen, to the federal courts, the judges, the prosecutors, the FBI directors, the CIA directors, the NSA directors, attorney generals all over the United States, all these big, powerful police agencies and government offices and government administrations. They're all financed and owned and directed and contributed to in vast, huge rivers of money printed from nothing by the corporations that own and operate the Federal Reserve. And those corporations that own and operate your Federal Reserve, they're owned by the royal families of the kings of the earth. You start taking a real long, hard, close look at how it is they're targeting people, Ammon Bundy. You take a long, close, hard look at why is it that the Department of Interior has prospecting maps for the Hammond's Ranch and the Bundy Ranch. Why is it that they have done geological studies all over America, and that's going to the Maddox Marketing Company in Glens Falls, New York? Excuse me. They just ran a bunch of stories about the low-flying airplanes in New York that are mapping all the rare earth materials all over New York. That's going to the Warren County Board of Supervisors. That's going to Andrew Cuomo, the governor of the state of New York, and Eric Schneiderman, the attorney general. What are all those low-flying aircraft, Mr. Schneiderman, with those magnetometers and those deep penetrating, ground penetrating radars flying all over New York State? And folks, I want you to remember something. When you take an aircraft with one of these ground penetrating radar detection systems dangling from the back of the aircraft, and some of the helicopters have probes, and they're using drones too to do this. That deep ground penetrating radar, it's deeply penetrating every human being on the ground as well. It's penetrating the kids. It's probing and penetrating right straight through the pregnant mothers with fetuses in their abdomens. It's penetrating through the brains and the body tissues of every person on the ground. It's not just penetrating deeply into the ground to locate all the valuable materials. And this is going to the Mannix. This is going to Margie Mannix and her brother. I can't remember her brother's name, and the father, and all the people that work for Mannix Marketing and work at the Adirondacker and work at the Adirondack Almanac and work for the Adirondack Council and work for the Sierra Club and the Adirondacks Museum of Hochschild Mining, the Adirondacks Museum of Amex American Metals, American Mining that's owned by the Hochschilds, the people that set up the forests in New York, the people that set up the Adirondack Park Agency, the people that set up the Temporary Study Commission on the future of the Adirondacks in the 21st century, the future of the Adirondacks and the Agenda 21. And now it's the Agenda 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, everything in the ground that's worth anything at all, everything in the ground that's worth anything at all, they're converting it to their own pocketbooks. They're lining their own pockets with it. And Ammon Bundy, you know I'm telling the truth. As for the beard and the hair, my family comes from just southwest of Colchester, England, at Witham, along the Witham River, across from Braintree. There in the vicinity of Witham Abbey, the Corinthian monastery where Robin Hood was written. These are historical facts. You can investigate me and my story all you want to. And what you're going to find out is that there's trillions of dollars, many trillions of dollars missing. And it's all been stolen through illegal, unrecorded, red flag, ghost, paper, wildcat, phantom, red flag, colonius, toxic zombie developments. Vast, funny little land development schemes like the dirt dealing and the land swindling the Clintons were involved in Arkansas, and what Jeb Bush and his family have been involved in Florida and up in Connecticut and Rhode Island and up in Maine. See, the Bushes and their extended family are involved in all these rackets as well with the Clintons and the Charlie Keatings and the Lee Farkases and the Penny Pritzkers and the Continental Illinois Bank of Chicago and the Penn Square Bank of Oklahoma City, and all those banks and savings and loans in Houston and Dallas and in San Antonio and all over rural Texas and all over Arizona and California and Hawaii and Alaska, New York and Maine and the Carolinas and Missouri and Utah and Idaho and Oregon and Washington. This land grabbing, this targeting of people for their natural resources, been going on since the days of Moses and the pharaohs. Anything valuable in the ground, that's what treasure is made of. Now, I know that this particular video is getting a little long-winded here, but there's a reason for it. You see, when you use fire to burn people out, like the BLM has been doing around the Hammonds Ranch, when you use fire around the Bundy Ranch, when the BLM can go around setting fires wherever they feel like setting fires, and whenever they feel like setting fires, and, setting a fire in the middle of the night to stalk and harass people and call it a lightning fire. Why has the West been so on fire? Does it make it a lot easier to go in and log because all the underbrush has been burnt off? Does it make it a lot easier to go in and establish mining roads because all the underbrush is gone? Do they use fire to make it easier for the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Land Management to go in and extract treasure? You see, Ammon, and all the other people that know me, even the French mountain boys, and they know who they are, and the Green Mountain Boys, and the White Mountain Boys, and the Smoky Mountain Boys, and the Blue Mountain Boys, and the Boston Mountain Boys, and the Ozark Mountain Boys, and the Wasatch Mountain Boys, and the Olympic Mountain Boys. All over this nation, the Sierra Mountain Boys. You got people that have been living on the land across this nation, across this continent for a long time. Some of them have gotten quite an education on how treasure rustlers, the land rustlers. This is what this is, Ammon Bundy. It's land rustlers. The EPA, Department of Interior, BLM. How is it that the United States government incorporated came to own all the Indian lands? The United States government owns huge, vast, unbelievable tracts of land that were kind of sort of stolen from their real owners. The whole freaking continent. It started with Sir Walter Raleigh in 1563, where the royal families of England decided to give all of America to Sir Walter Raleigh and to George Washington and to all the friends and military buddies of King George. Did I say King George Washington? Yes, I did. The British agent fought with General Braddock, that George Washington, and all of his land grants and land patents that he honored to all the friends and the family and the corporations and the supporters and the Tories that were in bed with the British Crown. All those land patents, all those land grants that were established by the British monarchy before the American Revolution, George Washington honored all of them. And the problem is, you see, is the royal family of England, London, where the Alexandria mining company's from, and all these other mining companies that are extracting in the West, taking all the treasure out of the ground and converting it to their own pocketbooks, a lot of those are owned by the English royal families and the French royal families and the Spanish royal families and China. China's got royal families that own these mining companies as well. You see, ladies and gentlemen, my family comes from the land of Robin Hood. This story of being targeted, this story of being stalked, this story of being controlled in the king's royal forests, it's in my family history. It's in every American's family history. You take a close, hard, long look at the feudal land system in England, and you realize that they established it here in America as well. Their serfdoms and their fiefdoms, and all the little small towns and cities and villages, and all these counties and all these different regions around the United States where people are targeted and harassed and stalked. Excuse me, by the powers that be. People out there know what I'm talking about. The powers that be that kill you off with death of 1,000 paper cuts, where they start harassing you and stalking you and causing you problems and dragging you into court over broken taillights and little nonsense on your cars. Now they're using the family court systems and planning and zoning and domestic abuse laws and family courts, foreclosure laws. People know what I'm talking about. There's millions of people across this country that have been subjected to the ominous power of the powers that be. The poobahs, the higher ups. You think I'm kidding around? Where does the term higher up even come from? Why is there a term higher up? Because I conjured it up? I don't think so. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, Ammon Bundy, and all those men and women that are standing up and supporting and standing shoulder to shoulder with you at that wildlife refuge. I want you to remember something, that the United States government and their public land trusts and the cheating on the homesteading acts and the desert, what they call that, the desert land acts. All these massive land acquisition schemes and scams of the 1800s, like what Weyerhaeuser engaged in. Take a look at the cheating and the fraud and the grabbing of the land, the Indian lands, by Weyerhaeuser Corporation, and then take a good long look at who owned and operated and created and benefits from Weyerhaeuser. You'll find yourself back in England, like with the International Paper Corporation. They're all royally owned. And I'll guarantee you that with this video, I'm on all the lists. I've been on all the lists for a long time, because Ammon, Clive, and Bundy, your wives, your families, your friends. See, the LDS Mormon Church in Utah is deeply involved with the United States government. They operate the NSA spy base outside the gates of Fort Williams. They operate and manage and maintain and build places like Hill Air Force Base. They work deeply with the FBI and the CIA. The Brigham Young University is deeply involved in training the agents for CIA and Department of Justice and FBI. The Mormon Church, the Quorum of 12 in Brigham Young University. I've done my homework on it, and I lived a long time in Utah. Why does the LDS Church disavow your actions? Why does the LDS Church not support your actions? You might want to take a look at their government contracts and the vast, massive mining and water and land and home building and subdivision development operations of the Mick Church there in Salt Lake City, called the Mormon Church. You might want to take a look into those financial arrangements of the Zion's Bank, the Utah Valley Credit Union, and Far West Bank. You might want to take a look at their money laundering track record for the drug cartels on the planet as well. The money laundering operations of the Zion's Bank. I don't care who, if you don't like the truth, get out of my country. That's the truth. Look into it. Look at all these great big giant banks that laundered huge, vast amounts of narcotics, dope money, terrorism money, extortion money, organized crime money. The biggest banks in the world have done it off of Wall Street in New York, not Old York, New York, not in Old England, in New England. They're in the Kings County of Manhattan there, Kings County, New York City. Look at the vast corruption in Albany. That's to all my friends up in the mountains in Albany. In New York. Take a look at the corruption in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and Seattle and Washington, D.C. Oh my God, Washington, D.C. and Miami and Tampa, St. Pete, Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Kansas City, Springfield, St. Louis, all over this nation from Honolulu to Fairbanks and Anchorage, Alaska, to the Carolinas. Take a look at the massive, unbelievable land swindles, the land scheming and scamming. Take a look at the massive real estate-based looting of the pension funds and of Wall Street and of all your savings and business accounts. Take a look who's running it, who's pulling the strings, who are the puppet masters are. And the puppet masters like Bernanke and Greenspan and Hank Snow and little Timmy Geithner and Janet Yellen and several presidents and a lot of congressmen and a whole bunch of senators that know for a fact that this video that I've just published to the world is absolutely no joke. And the links and the proof, you can begin by finding a site called Rico Realty, the missing trillions. Rico, racketeer-influenced corrupt organization, Rico Realty, the missing trillions, or the paper land con, or the Great Texas Bank Job, or all my videos and tapes, and begin to take a close, hard, long look at why it is that there's this giant, massive, real estate-based, real estate-centered, real estate-related, real estate-enabled, massive extracting and looting of this entire nation. And they did it in Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Great Britain, Spain, France, New Zealand, New South Wales, Australia, Japan. It's going on all over the world. These land swindling schemes and bank looting, robbery, crime sprees, these giant, massive crime sprees, where hundreds of billions and trillions have been stolen, it's all directly connected to these real estate schemes and scams. Just like the real estate of the Hammonds Ranch and the Bundy Ranch and all those other ranches in the West and all that other real estate that the United States government incorporated, appropriated from the real Americans, the first Americans, the Aboriginal Native American, the Indians, all that Indian land that was stolen. And by fiat decree, they declared them public lands. The United States government came up with this term called public land and wilderness and forests. They use language, Ammon Bundy. And to the FBI and the Department of Justice and all the investigators with the Oregon State Police and the news and the media and the free news media, the alternative news media, you need to begin to take a hard, long look at how it is Wall Street was robbed with subprime mortgage-backed securities and all these funky real estate deals and weird mortgages. All this real estate speculation. And it's been going on in America for a very long time. Folks, I know what it is like to be targeted with fire. I know what it's like to be targeted with explosives. I know what it's like to be targeted with false prosecutions and numerous false arrests and harassments and threats by law enforcement. I've had it done to me many times. My youngest daughter described it to me as a war zone. She grew up in a war zone. My oldest daughter told me recently that she knows that everything that I've experienced is real. That's my oldest daughter and my youngest daughter. My whole family witnessed to it. And there's families all over this nation that know it too. There's millions of witnesses to all of this. James Comey, Loretta Lynch, let's have a discussion about all this before the Congress and the Senate and the news cameras of the world. Let's talk about this video, this particular video. Let's talk about the whole thing. And let's see if old Judd Witham's right, or if Judd Witham's just some kind of a crazy nut militia patriot. My family showed up on this continent in 1628, 150 years. 150 years before the United States was ever even dreamt of. They were here long before the United States was. And our family got to know quite a few of the Native American tribes in the Northeast. The Delaware, the Iroquois, the Mohegan, Mohawken, the Abenaki, the Penobscot. My family been in the northeastern portion of this, what we call America, for nearly 400 years. Does Judson Witham know the historical truth and the historical facts? Well, let's see if the director of the FBI, James Comey, and the Attorney General of the United States, Loretta Lynch, want to have this discussion. Why is it that we had to bail out all the too big to fail banks? Why is it that all those banks are deeply, deeply, deeply involved in funny little real estate scheming and scamming and flippings? And subprime mortgage-backed derivative credit default swapping, patented, copywritten, and trademarked MERS, the old mortgage electronic registration system gang, and their real estate schemes. MERS and WAMU, Citibank, and Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo, and Bank of New York Mellon, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and I can go on and on and on with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and this giant VA, FHA, Farmers Home Administration, this giant, massive, unbelievable real estate fiasco. Why is it that the government's so deeply involved in it, James Comey? Why is the government so deeply involved in it, Andrew Cuomo? Eric Schneiderman, why did we create the Financial Fraud Investigation Task Force? Is it because Judd Witham's just making up stories? Is it because Judd Witham's confused and Judd Witham just doesn't know what he's talking about? Ammon Bundy, you watch this video and you share it with your friends as you're trying to stay warm out there on that Oregonian high Sierra Desert there this winter, with the FBI out there just trying to figure out how to route you fellas out of there. And to the ladies that are standing by these men, wow, what a pile of girls you are. Woo-hoo! How's that for a country boy's response? Them ladies are standing up with their men. And hey, I'll tell you what, some of them gals are pretty good with them old rabbit hunts, aren't they, fellas? They can go squirrel hunting. Some of them girls are pretty good squirrel hunters. Fisher, too. They go fishing, too. Trapping. Oh, my God. Some of them women know how to set a trap. And a lot of them know how to use a bow and arrow. And they've studied stock and game, and they know all about quiet. Sometimes you got to be quiet, Alan. I want you to know something, Mr. Bundy. There's patriot and militia all over this country. Some say there's millions of us. Some say there's millions of us. I hope you're hearing what I'm saying, Mr. Bundy. This real estate scheming and scamming and extracting, this real estate-based exploitation of the American people by the biggest corporations owned by the royal families of the earth, the kings of the earth, that's what's going on here. If you doubt me, take a look at who owns the corporations, who owns the Federal Reserve. You think I'm crazy? Go ahead, do the research. Find out who owns those big corporations that trade on Wall Street, and in London, and in Chicago on the Mercantile Exchange, and the exchanges around the world, from Singapore to Amsterdam to London, and the rest of the commodities and stock markets from Beijing, China, to Taiwan to Dubai. Good old Purple Capital. We didn't forget old Purple Capital and the Laba Betty gang from the Western Bank, Houston, Texas, at 1300 Main Street. We haven't forgotten those Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation gang out of Washington, D.C. and out of Dallas, Texas. And the details of the Penn Square failure and the Continental Illinois Bank failure and Enron and let's see, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch. Boy, oh, AIG. Oh, boy, don't talk about AIG, huh, Tim Geithner? What was they insuring again, Timmy Geithner? Why did you have to bail out AIG again, Timmy Geithner? Was it about a whole bunch of failed real estate transactions and failed mortgages that AIG had insured all over the world for the biggest investors on the planet? That's why you bailed AIG out for 100 cents on the dollar, Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan and Janet Yellen. Trillions, ladies and gentlemen, right up in smoke. Trillions. You think I'm kidding? Get a copy of the Wall Street Journal. Get a copy of the New York Times. Get a copy of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Get a copy of the LA Times. Get a copy of the Houston Chronicle. Get a copy of the Orlando Sentinel. Get a copy of the St. Petersburg, Tampa newspapers. Get a copy of the Boston Globe. Turn on ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox and PBS and start asking questions of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Matt Taibbi and that, who's that congresswoman from Ohio there? Can't think of her name. It'll come to me here in a minute. Get a hold of Joe Barton. Get a hold of Kevin Brady. Get a hold of them all. Get a hold of Greg Abbott. Ask old Greg Abbott and John Cornyn about the land deals in Texas. Get a hold of Jim Maddox. Get a hold of former United States Secret Service agent Rick Williams. He works for the corporate securities offices there for, what's the name of that oil company? Can't think of it right now. I'm having brain freeze. Former Secret Service agent Rick Williams. He's in the Woodlands. That's going out to K.C. Tuckless. She lives up there in the Woodlands. She knows what I'm talking about. Don't you, Miss Tuckless? Ladies and gentlemen, I can go on in this tape for hours, days, weeks, months. I've amassed so much information on what it is I've discussed in this short hour. Real estate, treasure, timber, water rights, minerals, gems, silver, gold, thorium, uranium, molybdenum, bauxite, wollastonite, titanium, manganese for aerospace, manganese. That's going out to my friends at the Great Saugatuck Deepening Project, Arthur Ambrosino, and to my friends up there at Old French Mountain. Show you something, folks. Everything we use, the nail clipper, the cell phone, the fork, the eyeglasses, the medicines. Let's not forget the salt. Let's not forget this salt. Okay? Let's not forget the salt. And the plastic, the container that International Paper Corporation makes from the trees. The wollastonite in this bottle and every other piece of plastic that you use. You see, the Rothschild Natural Resources Corporation, they understand rare earth materials. Just like the United States Geological Survey and Mannix Marketing out of Glens Falls and the Post-Star out of Glens Falls and the Lake George Mirror and the Adirondacker, that's some of my friends up at Hudson Falls, the Adirondacker, they know that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the extraction of the valuable treasure in the ground by the kings of the earth and all the corporations that own that Federal Reserve and all the other central banks around the world. The wars, the massively profitable military-industrial complex, the massively profitable military-financial complex, people that finance that district of criminals, D.C., 10 miles by 10 miles there on the Potomac, the District of Columbia, with their obelisk, however you say it there, on the mall, on the Washington reflection pool there, on the mall where the Washington Monument, the obelisk stands, and all their Romanesque and Greek temple buildings that are all over the District of Columbia, signifying the American Empire. Manifest destiny? No, it's been grand larceny by the bankster gangsters going back for centuries, all the way to the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. This empire and the extracting of treasure and the farming of human beings and the driving people off their land, and by coming up with schemes and scams to force people off their land so that people can steal it, like BLM and the Department of the Interior. These land scheming scams, Ammon Bundy, Clive and Bundy, and everybody that's paying attention. Take some time and enjoy all of my research. Take some time and listen to all of my videos. Listen very closely to them. And to the Justice Department of the United States, to the Director of the FBI, and to the Attorney General of the United States, and to all the news media out there. Let's have this conversation. It's time to have this conversation. Why is it that the Branch Davidians were crushed and burnt with fire? Was it their gun transactions with the people running around with Buffalo Air and Evergreen Airways, the Air America crew of Mena, Arkansas, and Barry Seals, and Gene Hoffenfuss, and the secret arming of the Ayatollahs from the basement of the White House and the National Security Agency? Why don't you ask Oliver North who Buffalo Airways is? Buffalo Airlines that were operating out of Waco, Texas. Why don't you ask Oliver North who Evergreen Airways is? Why don't you ask Oliver North where he got all those small arms that he shipped to Nicaragua and the Philippines and down in Panama, and to the Mujahideen and the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, and to the ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood? Where do they get all these small arms? Where do they get all this weaponry to supply to these freedom fighters that the Clintons and the Bushes and the Obamas and the Bidens and the Kerrys and the John Ashcrofts and the Ed Meese and the Janet Renos and the Alberto Gonzaleses and the Colin Powells? Where do they get all the small arms and the weapons to arm all these surrogate armies? Where do they get the military firepower to supply all those people with that weaponry? Interesting about the Waco Davidian mess and how the tanks came from Fort Hood. And then the Britain Defender, the Flair, the Norman Britain Defender, the Flair dropping flares on the Witham residence east of Conroe. It's time to have this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, because you know something, Ammon Bundy? The Witham family has been subjected to the same terrorism and the stalking and the harassment and the never-ending force you out tactics of the government. Just like the Hammonds and all those other ranchers that are being forced out and targeted and stalked by the government agents that want their land. I've been attacked, I've been stalked, I've been handcuffed, I've been falsely jailed, I've been called every crazy name in a book. And in final analysis here. I want to ask all the international news media. How many trillions of dollars were swindled using all these real estate schemes? Where'd all that money go? How'd they do it? Did they use unrecorded red flag, ghost paper, wildcat, phantom, felonious colonius, illegal substandard, subprime real estate swindling, and subprime real estate speculating? Is that what they used? Let's ask Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Matt Taibbi, and let's ask Eric Schneiderman and Eric Oler and Janet Reno, and let's bring Loretta Lynch and James Comey in to talk about these real estate schemes and scams and how all this money been robbed out of the system. That's my story, ladies and gentlemen. And to my mother and father, the Swamp Fox and Mrs. Swamp Fox, who are in heaven today, you see, what they did to my mother and father ruined their lives. What they did to my mother and father, my brothers and my sisters, really, really, really ruined our lives. With the mill pond, the flushing and the dumping of the lake so that the International Paper Corporation could turn their pinhole at the Alexandria Street Bridge and the penstock in the floodgates at Ticonderoga into ka-ching for the International Paper Corporation and all their buddies and their banks. The Lake George Paper Company, the Ticonderoga Paper Company, the Glens Falls Paper Company, the Finch Prine, the International Paper, all of them. That's going to my friends up on French Mountain. The people that supply the logs to those big paper companies. Small world, isn't it? Skip. Small world, isn't it, Amen? And to the LDS Church Quorum of 12 in Salt Lake City, shame on you. Because you know what's going on. Because it's your BYU graduates that are operating the NSA spy base at Fort Williams. How about that, Mr. Snowden? How about that, Mr. Assange? How about that, Alex Jones? The BYU cybersecurity program at Brigham Young University. Right there, 4 stories beneath the Central Library, right up the mall there at BYU from Stephen Jones' office at the Science Building at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Pretty interesting story there, that mega complex beneath the Central Library at the College of the Mormons, where they spy on everybody. They train everybody to spy on everybody, and they spy on everybody from beneath the Brigham Young University main library. Right across the street from the Reuben Clark Law School. Right next door to the United States Post Office. Did I say U.S. Post Office and U.S. Postal Inspectors and the 6 million square foot supercomputer that sits up on the hill there by Fort Williams? All those technicians, all those architects and engineers, all those contractors, all the people that supplied the building materials for the NSA Spy Center along Route 80, just a little west of Salt Lake City. They're right next door to Fort Williams. The War Operations Center up the road from can't remember the name of that chemical response base out there. Huge biological response base next to Fort Williams. Dugway Proving Grounds, there we go. The old Dugway Proving Grounds and the Hill Air Force Base up at Logan. Ogden, Logan, Ogden, Hill Air Force Base. All those Mormons that are deeply embedded with the United States military and the United States Justice Department and the FBI and the CIA, all those Mormons of the LDS Church, the Quorum of 12 in Salt Lake City. You listening to me, Ammon Bundy? Cliven Bundy, the Hammonds, all the Mormons in the West, Bunkerville, and the gold strike at Sutter's Mills, and the big California gold strike at Sutter's Mills, those people were Mormons. Imagine that. And there's a lot more to this story, but I can't go on forever today. I've got other things I've got to do. I hope you enjoy this particular video. I hope you've learned something. And please, absolutely, check out all the research and the links and ask yourself the most important question. Call your lifeline if you need to. How many trillions have been stolen with these real estate scheming and scamming schemes? These Ponzi cons and pyramid swindles. How many trillions have they stolen with all this real estate speculating and perpetrating? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for this discussion. I'm going to leave it right there. As always, God bless, and hasta la vista. We will be back.